The purple wildflowers bent beneath the Montana wind as smoke darkened the horizon. They said revenge was a path that consumed everything, even the soul that sought it. But in these mountains, justice and vengeance blurred like blood in creek water. A widow stood at her burned homestead, rifle in hand, medical bag at her feet, tools of healing repurposed for something darker. 5 graves had been dug in this valley over 15 years. Soon there would be more. The Blackwood gang had laughed when they took everything from her, not knowing what the war had taught her about suffering, about chemicals that burn from the inside out, about patience. They'd mocked her grief, called her defenseless. They should have asked themselves why a battlefield nurse who'd witnessed thousands die had chosen this remote valley to bury her secrets. By week's end, when their hideout erupted in flames and she vanished like morning mist, they would understand too late that some wounds never heal and some widows never forget. The Montana sun blazed crimson, bathing the remote valley where the Hawkins farm stood in fiery light. Elizabeth Hawkins, 50, paid no mind to its beauty. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space before the porch, where her old dog Scout lay, muzzle resting on his paws, breathing steadily. That faithful animal was the last friend she had left on this homestead. "Up, Scout," Elizabeth called softly. "We've got work to finish before nightfall." The old dog lifted his head, brown eyes gazing at his mistress with undemanding devotion. He rose slowly, joints creaking in protest. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Thomas had brought Scout home as a puppy nearly 15 years ago. Now both Thomas and Scout's youth lay beneath Montana soil. 6 months. It had been 6 months since Elizabeth had buried her husband. Lung disease had taken Thomas piece by piece, like a smoldering fire consuming a log. She had done everything possible with her medical knowledge, but it wasn't enough. Sometimes death needed no invitation. It simply came. Elizabeth walked into the stable with a bucket of water. Scout followed, tail wagging weakly. The 2 aging horses nickered in greeting. She stroked them, feeling their coarse hair beneath calloused fingers. Fingers that had once stitched wounds, held rifles, and finally clasped Thomas's hand as he drew his last breath. "I've asked you to sell them, Elizabeth. You can't manage this place alone." The voice came from the stable door. Mr. Simmons, the general store owner from White Ridge 10 miles away, stood there with his hat in hand. His face wore the expression of pity Elizabeth had grown all too familiar with in recent months. "I manage fine, Mr. Simmons," Elizabeth replied without turning. "I sent payment for the supplies last week." "It's not about the money," Simmons said, stepping into the stable's shadow. "The rumors about the Blackwood gang, they're moving this way. A woman living alone." Elizabeth turned, blue eyes cold as ice. "I survived the war, Mr. Simmons. I stitched men split open by cannon fire, held boys too young to die as they called for their mothers. I buried my daughter and my husband. Whatever threat you imagine the Blackwood gang poses, I assure you I've faced worse." Simmons twisted his hat nervously. "No disrespect to your strength, ma'am. Thomas was my friend. I promised him I'd look after you." Her expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your concern, but this is my home. At least consider coming to town until... Thank you for delivering the flour." Elizabeth cut him off. "I'll need more medical supplies next week." Simmons knew a dismissal when he heard one. He nodded, replaced his hat, and left the stable. Elizabeth listened to the sound of his wagon departing before exhaling heavily. She knew the Blackwood gang's stories weren't mere rumors. 3 ranches north of White Ridge had been hit in the last month. Men killed, women terrorized, livestock stolen, but this land was all she had left. The small farm she and Thomas had built from nothing after fleeing the horrors of the war. Their sanctuary from the nightmares that still plagued her sleep. "They won't take this from me too, Scout," she whispered, patting the dog's gray muzzle. "I won't let them." As twilight descended, Elizabeth carried a bouquet of wild purple flowers to the small plot behind the house. 2 graves rested there, one older and smaller than the other. The wooden cross marking the larger grave still looked fresh. The name Thomas Hawkins carved carefully into its surface. Beside it, a weathered cross read, "Sarah Hawkins." Elizabeth placed half the flowers on Thomas's grave, the other half on Sarah's. She knelt between them, her worn dress pooling around her. "I miss you both," she whispered. The farm yielded well today. Those seedlings you planted before you left us. Thomas, they're growing strong. She touched the smaller cross. 15 years today, my sweet girl. Not a day passes that I don't see your smile. As darkness fell, Elizabeth lit an oil lamp in the modest cabin. She removed a loose floorboard beneath her bed, retrieving a tin box. Inside lay her most precious possessions. Thomas's Union Army medal, a small daguerreotype of Sarah at age 10, and a leather-bound journal with yellowed pages. She opened the journal fingertips, tracing her careful handwriting from those desperate days in field hospitals, pages of medical notations, herbal remedies, chemical formulas she'd developed when conventional treatments failed, knowledge that had saved lives and taken them when mercy demanded it. Elizabeth had closed this chapter of her life when they'd moved west. Thomas had convinced her to leave the darkness behind to focus on healing rather than harm. "The war's over, Lizzie," he'd said. "We don't have to carry its ghost with us forever." She'd promised him. For 15 years, she'd kept that promise even after they'd buried their daughter, even when she'd recognized the name Blackwood in whispered stories around Whiteridge and felt her blood run cold. A sudden bark from Scout broke her reverie. Elizabeth closed the journal, returning it to its hiding place. She took her husband's old rifle from above the fireplace and moved to the window. In the moonlight, she could make out riders approaching, 5 of them, moving slowly but purposefully toward her farm. "So they've come," she murmured, checking the rifle's ammunition. It was loaded, but 5 bullets against 5 riders weren't odds she favored. She knew better strategies from her time in the war. Elizabeth quickly doused the lamp. "Scout, quiet," she commanded in a hushed tone. The old dog obeyed instantly, years of training overriding his instinct to warn of intruders. She moved silently to the back door, grabbing her medical bag, not for any healing purpose, but for the small vials nestled inside its leather compartments. Just in case the riders surrounded the cabin, Elizabeth remained still, watching. Through a small gap in the curtains, their leader dismounted, a tall man with a jagged scar splitting his right cheek. Even in the moonlight, she could see the Confederate gray of his duster. "Mrs. Hawkins," the man called, voice carrying easily in the night air. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk business." Elizabeth remained silent. Scout pressed against her leg, a low growl building in his throat. "Your farm sits on a convenient trail," the man continued. "My boys and I need safe passage. We're willing to pay for protection. Protection money." The classic opening move. Elizabeth had heard how the Blackwood gang operated. First came offers of protection, then demands, then violence when refused. "Mrs. Hawkins," the man's voice hardened, "don't make this difficult. We can be reasonable men or not." At a signal from their leader, 2 men approached the door. Elizabeth calculated her options rapidly. If she fired, she might take down 2, possibly 3 before they rushed her. Not good enough. "I'll speak with you," she called through the door, "but I keep my rifle ready." A dark chuckle. "Fair enough, ma'am." Elizabeth opened the door, rifle indeed in hand, pointed generally toward the men, but not directly at anyone. A gesture of caution, not outright hostility. Yet the scarred man smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Jed Blackwood, ma'am, at your service." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "These are my associates." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as they slid past Blackwood to the other men. 4 rough-looking figures, each armed, each with eyes that had seen and done terrible things. Her gaze lingered momentarily on a younger man at the back, something vaguely familiar in his features. "I have nothing you want," Elizabeth said flatly. "This farm barely supports me." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Now that's not entirely true. You have location, Mrs. Hawkins, you have solitude. We simply require occasional use of your property to move certain goods." "Foreign stolen goods," Elizabeth stated. It wasn't a question. A shadow passed over Blackwood's face. "Business goods, we'd compensate you." "Of course. I'm not interested. Now please leave my property." The men exchanged glances. One spat tobacco juice onto her porch. Another fingered his pistol meaningfully. "Perhaps I haven't made myself clear," Blackwood said, his voice hardening. This isn't a request. The last fellow who declined our business proposal suffered an unfortunate accident. Terrible fire burned him and his livestock alive. Elizabeth felt ice in her veins, but her expression remained impassive. She'd faced worse men during the war, men who'd lost their humanity entirely. I'm declining, she said firmly, and I'll be reporting this visit to Sheriff Mason tomorrow. At the mention of the sheriff, one of the men snickered. Blackwood smiled indulgently. Mason, he knows better than to interfere with legitimate business arrangements. Blackwood stepped closer, his scarred face now clearly visible in the moonlight. Think carefully, Mrs. Hawkins. A woman alone, accidents happen. Scout growled, sensing the threat. Blackwood's eyes dropped to the dog. Loyal beast, he remarked. Shame if something happened to him too. Elizabeth's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the rifle's trigger. 20 years ago, she would have shot him without hesitation. But Thomas's voice echoed in her memory. We came west to heal Lizzie, not to bring more violence into the world. You have until the end of the week to reconsider, Blackwood said, stepping back. We'll return for your answer then. As suddenly as they had appeared, the riders mounted and vanished into the darkness, leaving Elizabeth standing in her doorway, rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. Once she was certain they were gone, Elizabeth closed and barred the door. She sank into Thomas's old rocking chair, trembling now that no one could see. Scout laid his head in her lap, whining softly. What would you have me do, Thomas? She whispered to the empty room. What choice have they left me? In the morning light, White Ridge looked almost peaceful. False-fronted buildings lined its single dirt street, giving the young town an air of respectability it hadn't quite earned. Elizabeth tied her horse outside the sheriff's office, adjusting her plain black bonnet. She rarely came to town since Thomas's passing, preferring the solitude of her farm to pitying glances and whispered condolences. The sheriff's office was a modest wooden structure with a small jail attached to its rear. As Elizabeth entered, Sheriff Robert Mason looked up from his desk, surprise evident on his weathered face. Mrs. Hawkins, he said, standing quickly. This is unexpected. Elizabeth had met Mason only a handful of times. He was a large man in his mid-50s with iron-gray hair and a bristling mustache. The silver star on his chest seemed almost dwarfed by his broad frame. Sheriff, she acknowledged, I need to report trespassers. Mason gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please sit. Would you like coffee? Elizabeth remained standing. No, thank you. Jed Blackwood and 4 men came to my farm last night. They threatened me. The sheriff's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Blackwood, you say what kind of threats? Elizabeth recounted the encounter in precise detail. As she spoke, she noticed a young deputy lingering by the doorway, listening intently. Something about his lean frame and the way he held himself reminded her of the soldiers she'd treated alert, ready for trouble. Did Blackwood specifically threaten violence? Mason asked when she finished. He implied it, mentioned a fire that killed someone who refused him. Mason sighed, rubbing his mustache. The Peterson place officially ruled an accident. You don't believe that? What I believe and what I can prove are different matters, Mrs. Hawkins. He leaned forward. Blackwood has connections. The territorial judge has dismissed 2 cases against him already. Elizabeth felt a cold anger building inside her. So you won't help? I didn't say that. Mason stood pacing behind his desk. I'll send Jake here to patrol near your property for the next few days. He nodded toward the young deputy. But I strongly suggest you consider Blackwood's offer. You want me to allow criminals to use my farm? Elizabeth asked incredulously. Mason looked uncomfortable. I want you to stay alive, ma'am. Blackwood doesn't make idle threats. The deputy Jake stepped forward. Sheriff, we could set up a watch rotation. Miller and I could. We don't have the men. Mason cut him off. And we don't have evidence of any crime yet. He turned back to Elizabeth. If they return, don't confront them. Send word immediately. Elizabeth recognized dismissal when she heard it. She nodded stiffly, turning to leave. Mrs. Hawkins, Mason called after her. I knew your husband Thomas was a good man. He wouldn't want you risking your life over principle. She paused at the door. Thomas is dead. Sheriff and principal is all I have left. Outside, Elizabeth blinked in the harsh sunlight. The visit had gone exactly as she'd expected. The law could not protect her. She was on her own just as she had been so many times during the war. When supplies ran short and wounded men screamed for relief she couldn't provide through conventional means, her next stop was Goldman's apothecary at the end of the street. Unlike the other clapboard storefronts, Goldman's shop was built of stone, with small, high windows that kept the interior cool and dark. The bell above the door jangled as Elizabeth entered Elias. Goldman looked up from his mortar and pestle spectacles, sliding down his nose. At 70, his hands still worked with the precision that had made him one of the finest field surgeons in the Union Army. "Elizabeth," he said warmly, "twice in 1 month. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need supplies, Elias," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Goldman's smile faded. He set down his pestle and moved to lock the front door, turning the sign to "closed." "What kind of supplies?" he asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew. "The kind we used at Antietam," Elizabeth replied. "When the gangrene cases overwhelmed us." Goldman removed his spectacles, polishing them nervously on his apron. "Those were desperate times, Elizabeth. Measures we took because we had no choice. I have no choice now." He studied her face. "The Blackwood gang." Elizabeth nodded. Goldman sighed deeply. "Thomas made you promise to leave that life behind. Thomas isn't here to protect our home anymore." Elizabeth's voice remained steady, though her heart ached. "Will you help me, or must I find another way?" Goldman's shoulders slumped in resignation. He moved to the back of his shop, returning with a small wooden case. "I'll prepare what you need." "But Elizabeth," his aged eyes met hers. "Once you start down this path again, there may be no returning." "I know," she whispered. "I know better than anyone." While Goldman worked, Elizabeth browsed the shop, eventually pausing before a shelf of purple wildflowers drying from the ceiling beams. "Your monk's hood came in well this year," she observed. Goldman glanced up. "Yes, poisonous, of course, but excellent for certain heart conditions in careful doses." Elizabeth nodded, reaching up to touch the delicate dried blossoms. "May I take some? They remind me of the flowers that grew behind our field hospital." "Of course," Goldman said, not mentioning that monk's hood hadn't grown anywhere near their field hospital. They both knew what the flowers were really for. An hour later, Elizabeth rode out of town with her saddlebags heavier than when she'd arrived. As she passed the cemetery on the outskirts of White Ridge, she slowed her horse. On impulse, she dismounted and walked among the graves until she found Thomas's parents' markers. Her in-laws had died before she and Thomas had moved west, but he'd insisted on placing memorial stones here. Elizabeth knelt before them. "I may break my promise to your son," she murmured, "but I'll save the home we built, whatever it costs me." As she stood to leave, she noticed a freshly dug grave nearby. The raw earth had been covered with pine branches, but no marker stood yet at its head. A small wooden plaque lay on the ground. "John Peterson and family, rest in peace." A cold certainty settled in Elizabeth's chest. The family Blackwood had burned alive when they refused his demands, a father, mother, and 3 children if the stories were true. Climbing back on her horse, Elizabeth rode for home, her resolve hardening with each mile. 3 days passed without incident. Elizabeth used the time to prepare. She moved her most precious possessions, Thomas's medal, Sarah's daguerreotype, and her medical journal to a secure hiding place in the root cellar. She also dug up a small metal box buried beneath the rose bush Thomas had planted for their 10th anniversary. Inside lay nearly $200 in gold and silver coins, their life savings. She gave half to Scout to carry in a pouch strapped to his collar. "Go to Goldman's," she whispered, using the special command Thomas had taught the dog years ago. Scout looked at her with mournful eyes but obeyed, trotting away toward town. If nothing else, at least some of their money would reach safety. That evening, Elizabeth prepared her defenses, working methodically as twilight faded to darkness. She mixed the chemicals Goldman had provided according to formulas she'd developed during the war's darkest days. Formulas she'd sworn never to use again. Some she placed in strategic locations around the property. Others she kept in small vials in her apron pocket. As she worked, memories surfaced. Memories of a battlefield hospital overrun with gangrene cases, of soldiers screaming as surgeons sawed through infected limbs without enough chloroform to go around. Of Elizabeth discovering that certain chemical combinations could cauterize wounds from the inside out, saving limbs but causing excruciating pain. And later, when applied differently, offering merciful release to the suffering, beyond all hope of recovery. Thomas had found her administering such mercy to a young Confederate soldier with half his face blown away. He hadn't judged her, had merely helped her perfect the formulas to cause less suffering. But he'd made her promise when the war ended, so would her work with such dangerous knowledge, a promise she was about to break. Night had fully descended when Elizabeth heard horses approaching. Not attempting stealth this time, Blackwood wanted her to know they were coming. She quickly lit a single lamp, positioning it to cast her shadow on the curtained window. Then she slipped outside through the back door, taking position behind the woodpile, with clear sight lines to the cabin's approach. 5 riders, same as before. They dismounted, confidence evident in their swagger. Blackwood stepped forward. "Mrs. Hawkins, I've come for your answer." When no response came from the cabin, one of the men laughed nervously. "Maybe she ran off." "No," Blackwood said, eyes fixed on the shadow visible through the curtain. "She's in there, stubborn woman." He nodded to 2 of his men. "Check the barn and outbuildings. Peterson had a shotgun waiting for us, remember?" The men complied, moving toward the small barn. Elizabeth remained motionless, scarcely breathing. If they searched thoroughly, they would find her, but she was counting on their arrogance. "Last chance, Mrs. Hawkins." Blackwood called, "Come out and talk business, or we burn it all down with you inside." When silence again met his threat, Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "Your choice." He turned to his remaining men. "Torch the place." One of the men hesitated. "Boss, shouldn't we check inside first? Might be valuables." "Do it," Blackwood snapped. "This bitch needs to learn what happens to people who defy me." As the men approached the cabin with lit torches, Elizabeth knew her moment had come. She raised her rifle and fired a single shot, not at the men, but at a small jar positioned beneath the cabin's porch. The resulting explosion was modest but effective, throwing the men backward in a shower of splinters and chemical flame. Screams erupted as the specialized compound made contact with skin, burning hot and impossible to extinguish with water. In the confusion, Elizabeth moved swiftly to her next position behind the well. Another shot, another targeted explosion near the barn entrance. The 2 men searching there stumbled out, arms flailing against the clinging fire. Blackwood, thrown clear of the initial blast, recovered quickly. "It's a trap," he bellowed, drawing his pistol. "Find her." Elizabeth ducked as bullets splintered the wood above her head. She needed to move again, but Blackwood was firing methodically in her direction, pinning her down. One of his men, face partially melted from the chemical fire, staggered toward the well. Elizabeth had no choice. She rose slightly and fired directly at him. The bullet took him in the chest, dropping him instantly. 4 left a movement to her right, one of the gang members trying to flank her. Elizabeth rolled away from the well just as bullets struck where she'd been hiding. She came up in a crouch behind the rain barrel, breathing hard. The old moves from the war were coming back, but she wasn't a young woman anymore. She couldn't keep this up much longer. "I see her," shouted one of the men, raising his rifle. Before he could fire, a gray blur launched from the shadows. Scout returned from his errand, leaped at the man's throat with a feral growl. Man and dog went down in a tangle of limbs and snarls. "Shoot the damn dog!" "Agger," Blackwood ordered, still trying to locate Elizabeth. A gunshot cracked. Scout yelped once, then was silent. Something broke inside Elizabeth at that sound. A dam of restraint built over 15 years of peaceful farming, shattered with cold precision. She removed a vial from her pocket, uncorked it with her teeth, and threw it with perfect accuracy toward the 2 men standing closest to each other. The glass shattered at their feet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a green-tinged flame erupted, engulfing them both. Their screams echoed across the farmyard as they clawed at their burning clothes, their burning skin, their burning eyes. Blackwood, witnessing his men's agony, lost his composure. "What kind of witch are you?" he shouted, firing wildly into the darkness. Elizabeth didn't respond. She was already moving to her final position behind the stone trough. Only Blackwood and one other man remained upright. The odds had improved. The remaining gang member panicked, running for the horses. Elizabeth let him go. She wanted Blackwood. "Your men are dead or gone," she called out, her voice eerily calm. "Leave my property and never return, and you might live to see morning." Blackwood's response was a barrage of gunfire in her direction. "I'll burn you alive. I'll feed you to my dogs, piece by piece." Elizabeth waited out his rage and the eventual click of his empty chamber. Then she stood, rifle aimed steady at his chest. "You made a mistake coming here," she said quietly. "You made a bigger mistake killing my dog." Blackwood stared at her, sudden fear in his eyes as he recognized something in her expression. The look of someone who had dealt death before and would do so again without hesitation. "Wait," he stammered, raising his hands. "We can talk." Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger. Then unexpectedly the crack of a rifle came from behind her. Pain blossomed in her shoulder, spinning her around. She fell to one knee, gripping her bleeding arm. The fifth man, the young one who had seemed vaguely familiar, emerged from the shadows, rifle still trained on her. "Good work, Frank," Blackwood said, relief evident in his voice. "I thought she had me." Frank approached slowly, keeping his rifle aimed at Elizabeth. Now that he was closer, she could see his features clearly in the light from the burning cabin. The resemblance that had nagged at her became suddenly horribly clear. "You're Thomas's brother," she gasped. Frank Hawkins didn't acknowledge her recognition. "We're taking the farm, Jed," he said, eyes never leaving Elizabeth. "That was our deal." Blackwood retrieved his pistol, reloading it casually. "Of course, once we clean up this mess," he gestured to his dead and dying men. "Your sister-in-law has quite a temper." "She always did," Frank replied coldly. "My brother was a fool to marry her." Elizabeth's mind raced through the implications. Thomas's estranged younger brother, whom they hadn't seen in over a decade, in league with Blackwood. The farm, of course. Thomas had inherited the land grant that brought them west land that should have been shared with Frank, had the brothers not fallen out over Frank's Confederate sympathies. "Why?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Frank's mouth twisted. "This was supposed to be mine too. Then you poisoned Thomas against me with your Yankee lies." "Thomas didn't approve of you executing Union prisoners," Elizabeth corrected, the old anger flaring, despite her precarious situation. "Neither did your parents." Frank's face hardened. "Doesn't matter now. Thomas is dead, and this land comes to me." Blackwood stepped forward, pistol raised. "Touching family reunion. Time to wrap it up." Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. If she was to die, she would do so with dignity. Behind them, her cabin was fully engulfed in flames, the heat intense even at this distance. Everything she and Thomas had built together being consumed before her eyes. Then she spotted movement near the burning barn, a figure slipping through the shadows. The young deputy, Jake, rifle raised as he took careful aim at Blackwood's back. Elizabeth needed to buy time. "Before you kill me," she said to Blackwood, "you should know about the buried gold." Blackwood hesitated, greed warring with caution. "What gold?" "Thomas and I didn't trust banks. 2,000 in double eagles buried under the rose bush. A massive exaggeration, but Blackwood wouldn't know that." Frank's eyes narrowed. "She's lying." "Maybe," Blackwood conceded, "but we should check before—" The crack of Jake's rifle interrupted him. Blackwood staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as blood blossomed on his chest. He fired wildly as he felt his bullet grazing Elizabeth's temple. The world tilted, darkness encroaching on her vision. She was vaguely aware of Frank returning fire, of Jake charging forward, of more gunshots. Then nothing but the roar of flames and a descending veil of unconsciousness. Elizabeth's last thought before the darkness claimed her was of Thomas and Sarah waiting for her beyond the veil. "I'm coming," she whispered. "I'm finally coming home." But death did not claim Elizabeth Hawkins that night. She awoke to pain and the smell of antiseptic. Blinking against harsh sunlight, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, bandages wrapped around her head and shoulder. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Was this a field hospital, Had the last 15 years been a dream? "You're awake," said a voice to her right. "Good. I was beginning to worry." Elizabeth turned her head carefully. Elias Goldman sat beside her, bed medical bag open on a small table. "Where?" she began, her voice a dry rasp. "My home," Goldman replied, helping her sip water from a cup. "Above the apothecary, Deputy Miller. Brought you in 3 nights ago, half dead from blood loss." Memory flooded back the attack. Scout the flames, Frank's betrayal. "Jake Miller," she murmured. "He saved me." Goldman nodded. "Foolish boy, followed you home after you left town. Said he didn't trust the sheriff to provide proper protection." He adjusted her bandages with gentle hands. "Lucky for you he did. Blackwood, dead shot through the heart, and Frank Thomas's brother." Goldman's expression turned grim. "Escaped he wounded Deputy Miller before fleeing." Elizabeth closed her eyes, processing this information. "My farm, burned to the ground. I'm afraid nothing left but ashes." A single tear escaped from beneath her closed eyelid. Everything gone. The home she and Thomas had built, the graves of her family, all her possessions save the money Scout had delivered. Scout. The memory of his final yelp made her flinch. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," Goldman said softly. "So much loss." She opened her eyes, a new resolve hardening within her. "Frank will go to the rest of Blackwood's gang. I need to heal quickly." Goldman studied her face. "What are you planning?" "Justice," she replied simply. "The law failed me." Elizabeth struggled to sit up. "Failed the Petersons, will fail again, unless someone acts." Goldman gently pressed her back against the pillows. "You need rest, recovery. At least a week before you can travel." "I don't have a week. Frank knows I'm alive. He'll be gathering the rest of Blackwood's men." "Then let me help you," Goldman said. "Like old times." Elizabeth looked at her old comrade, remembering the horrors they'd faced together during the war, the lives they'd saved and those they'd ended out of mercy or necessity. "Are you sure this won't be like the war?" "Elias, this will be justice," he finished for her. "Or vengeance, perhaps both." She nodded slowly. "Both over the next 3 days." Elizabeth regained her strength with remarkable speed. Goldman's medical skills combined with her own knowledge of healing herbs accelerated her recovery. By the 4th day, she could stand without assistance, though her shoulders still throbbed when she moved too quickly. During this time, Jake Miller visited whenever his duties permitted. The young deputy's left arm was in a sling, where Frank's bullet had grazed him, but he seemed more concerned with Elizabeth's condition than his own. Sheriffs handed this whole business over to the territorial marshal. Jake informed them during one visit. "Says it's beyond his jurisdiction now." "I don't know. Convenient," Elizabeth remarked bitterly. Jake nodded. "Mason's not a bad man. Just cautious. Blackwood had friends in high places." "And the rest of Blackwood's gang?" Goldman asked. "Vanished. Probably holed up in their hideout in the Bitterroot Mountains. That's where Frank will have gone." Elizabeth absorbed this information silently. The Bitterroot Mountains were rugged, unforgiving terrain. Finding the gang's hideout wouldn't be easy, unless someone already knew where to look. "Deputy Miller," she said carefully, "how much do you know about the Blackwood gang's operations?" Jake hesitated, something flickering in his eyes. "More than most. Why did you really follow me that night?" The young man looked away. "I had my reasons." Goldman cleared his throat. "Elizabeth, perhaps we shouldn't interrogate the man who saved your life." But Elizabeth kept her gaze fixed on Jake. "Your mother's name was Catherine, wasn't it? Catherine Reynolds before she married." Jake's head snapped up, surprise evident on his face. "How did you—" "You have her eyes," Elizabeth said softly. "I delivered her baby during the Warfield Hospital outside Nashville, December 1863. A boy, she named him Jacob." Goldman looked between them in astonishment. "You're saying Deputy Miller is the son of my friend Catherine?" Elizabeth confirmed. "She wrote to me for years, told me her son had become a lawman in Montana Territory." Jake swallowed hard. "She told me about you too. The nurse who saved us both when the doctors had given up. Said I wouldn't be alive if not for your special medicines." "Why didn't you say something when we met at the sheriff's office?" I wasn't sure it was you. Not until I saw what you did at the farm. Jake leaned forward. Mother said you had skills. Knowledge most doctors didn't. She said if I ever needed help that the law couldn't provide, I should find you. Elizabeth understood then. You knew what Blackwood was planning. You came to warn me. Jake nodded. Too late as it turned out. His expression darkened. Blackwood's men killed my fiance's family last year. The law did nothing. I've been working at the sheriff's office gathering information, waiting for my chance. Revenge, Goldman murmured. Justice, Jake corrected firmly. I know where their hideout is. I've been there collecting evidence. Elizabeth and Goldman exchanged glances. A silent understanding passed between them. We'll need supplies, Elizabeth said, and a plan. As they began plotting, none of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, a young woman with long dark hair observing the apothecary's windows with intense concentration. After several minutes, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the crowd of a town oblivious to the storm gathering in its midst. The Bitterroot Mountains loomed against the dawn sky, their jagged peaks painted copper and gold by the rising sun. Elizabeth Hawkins studied them from horseback, her body still aching from wounds not fully healed. Beside her, Elias Goldman adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the rough map Jake Miller had drawn for them. That ravine should lead us to the old mining trail, Goldman said, pointing to a dark crease in the foothills. If Deputy Miller's information is correct, the Blackwood hideout is another 4 hours' ride beyond. Elizabeth nodded, her expression betraying nothing of the pain each movement caused her. The bandage beneath her clothing was spotted with fresh blood, where her stitches had stretched during their night ride from White Ridge. Goldman had noticed little escaped his physician's eye, but had said nothing. They both knew time was of the essence. Frank Hawkins had a 3-day head start. By now he would have reached the remnants of Blackwood's gang and assumed leadership, perhaps even set in motion whatever plans Blackwood had been brewing before Elizabeth's resistance had derailed them. Are you certain about this course, Elizabeth? Goldman asked quietly. There are other paths. The law failed me. She interrupted, failed everyone who crossed Blackwood's path. Deputy Miller is one man with a wounded arm and a badge that carries no weight in these mountains. Elizabeth adjusted her hat against the growing light. We've discussed this, Elias. You can still turn back. Goldman's weathered face creased into a wry smile, and missed the chance to play cavalry surgeon again. Besides, someone needs to keep your wounds from festering. Elizabeth returned his smile briefly before spurring her horse forward. Then let's not waste daylight. They rode in silence through the morning, following the ravine as it curved into the mountains. The terrain grew steadily more challenging, loose shale slopes giving way to dense pine forests cut by swift, narrow streams. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley. White Ridge now, just a smudge of brown and gray in the vast landscape. As they paused to rest the horses, Elizabeth removed a small leather case from her saddlebags. Inside lay the vials and powders Goldman had prepared in his shop, compounds, similar to those she'd used at the farm, but refined, more targeted in their effects. You remember the proportions? Goldman asked, watching her check each container methodically. Of course, Elizabeth met his gaze. I remember everything from those days, Elias. Every formula, every application, every death, he added softly. She didn't respond directly. Instead, she said, Thomas wanted me to forget, to build something pure and new, untainted by what we did in the war. Her hands stilled on the case. But some knowledge can't be unlearned, and sometimes it serves a purpose. The law cannot, Goldman nodded slowly. Just remember why we developed these compounds in the first place, Elizabeth. To end suffering, not cause it. Blackwood's men forfeited any claim to mercy when they burned the Peterson family alive. Elizabeth's voice had acquired the hard edge Goldman remembered from battlefield hospitals. When they killed Scout, when they took everything I had left. Before Goldman could respond, a sound caught their attention. Horses' hooves on stone. Approaching from the trail ahead, Elizabeth quickly secured the leather case and drew her rifle. Goldman did the same, though his hands weren't as steady as hers. Behind those rocks, Elizabeth whispered, indicating a granite outcropping. If it's Frank or his men, we'll have the high ground. They concealed themselves just as three riders appeared around a bend in the trail. Not Frank, Elizabeth noted with a mixture of relief and annoyance. Sheriff Mason rode in front, flanked by Jake Miller and another deputy she didn't recognize. They followed us, Goldman murmured. Your young friend must have... He's not my friend, Elizabeth interrupted coldly. He's Catherine's son, that's all. She stood, making no attempt to hide. Sheriff Mason, she called out. You're a long way from your jail. Mason reined his horse to a stop, spotting her above the trail. His expression suggested he wasn't surprised to find her there. Mrs. Hawkins, he returned. Dr. Goldman. Taking in the mountain air, are you? Something like that, Elizabeth replied evenly. Why are you here? Sheriff Mason dismounted, signaling his deputies to remain on horseback. Deputy Miller seems to think you're planning to take the law into your own hands regarding Frank Hawkins and what's left of the Blackwood gang. Elizabeth didn't bother denying it. Your law failed 5 people dead at the Peterson farm, my home destroyed. How many more before you act? Mason sighed heavily, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. I understand your anger, ma'am, but vigilante justice isn't the answer. Then what is another strongly worded letter to the territorial judge, the same judge who dismissed 2 previous cases against Blackwood? The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. The territorial marshal is coming from Helena. Next week, maybe 2. He'll have the authority to. In 2 weeks, Frank Hawkins could burn half the territory. Elizabeth cut in. You know what they're capable of. I do, Mason acknowledged. Which is why I can't let you and the doctor ride to your deaths. Whatever you're planning, they'll outnumber you 5 to 1 at least. Goldman climbed down from the rocks to join them on the trail. What do you propose instead, Sheriff? That we all return to White Ridge and wait for more graves to be dug? Mason looked between them, then up at Jake, who had been conspicuously silent during the exchange. I'm proposing we work together, the sheriff said finally. I know where they're hiding. I know their strength. And unlike you two, I have a badge that might just keep this from becoming a bloodbath. Elizabeth studied Mason's face, searching for deception. Why the sudden change of heart? Sheriff, you weren't so eager to confront Blackwood when I came to your office. Things have changed, Mason said grimly. The territorial governor's nephew was on the eastern-bound stage that Blackwood's men hit yesterday, killed in the robbery. Now I have the authorization I needed. Convenient, Elizabeth remarked. Important men's relatives have to die before the law takes notice. That's not fair, Mrs. Hawkins, Jake interjected, speaking for the first time. Sheriff Mason has been building a case against Blackwood for months. He just couldn't move without jurisdiction. Elizabeth turned her cold gaze on the young deputy. And who told you we were heading into the mountains, Deputy Miller? After providing us with such detailed directions to the Blackwood hideout, Jake had the grace to look ashamed. I couldn't let you go alone. Not against those odds. So you betrayed our confidence? I tried to protect you, Jake insisted, like you protected my mother. Goldman laid a restraining hand on Elizabeth's arm. Perhaps we should consider the sheriff's proposal, he suggested quietly. 4 guns are better than 2, and a legal approach might prevent excesses. Elizabeth knew what he meant. Goldman had always been uncomfortable with the darker applications of their medical knowledge. During the war, he had looked the other way when she administered her merciful poisons to the dying, but active participation in such acts went against his physician's oath. What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff? She asked. Finally, Mason squared his shoulders. We ride together to the Blackwood hideout. We arrest Frank Hawkins and any gang members we find. We bring them back to stand trial for their crimes. And if they resist, then we defend ourselves as the law allows. Elizabeth laughed humorlessly. You've never faced men like these, have you, Sheriff? They won't surrender to your badge. They'll fight to the death or worse. They'll pretend to surrender, then slit your throats when you sleep. Mason's expression hardened. I fought at Gettysburg, Mrs. Hawkins. I've faced men like these and worse. Then you should know better than to expect justice to come from a polite request to surrender. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for Goldman's pragmatic intervention. The sun's climbing, and we're wasting daylight. he pointed out. Every hour gives Frank more time to prepare. Why don't we continue this discussion as we ride? Reluctantly, Elizabeth nodded. She and Goldman retrieved their horses and fell in beside Mason's party. As they rode, Elizabeth kept to herself, mind working through the new complications Mason's presence created. Her plans would need adjustment. The chemicals in her saddlebags would have to be deployed discreetly, if at all. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine forest gave way to barren rocky slopes, where only the hardiest shrubs clung to life. By late afternoon, they had reached a ridge overlooking a secluded valley. Mason raised his hand, signaling a halt. There, he said, pointing to a cluster of rough-hewn buildings nestled against the far mountainside. The old redemption mine played out 10 years ago, but the buildings are sound. Blackwood's been using it as his base for at least a year. Elizabeth studied the camp through narrowed eyes. Even at this distance, she could make out figures moving between the structures, men loading wagons, tending horses, preparing to move by all appearances. I count at least 12 men, she murmured, plus Frank, Jake added, and possibly others inside the buildings. Mason nodded grimly. More than I expected. They must be consolidating after Blackwood's death. So much for your arrest plan, Elizabeth observed. Even if we had twice our number, those are poor odds. The sheriff's jaw tightened. We need to get closer, observe their routine, find weaknesses. There. Goldman pointed to a narrow defile that appeared to lead down into the valley, sheltered from view by a line of stunted pines. We could approach unseen at least until the last 100 yards. Mason considered this. We'll make camp here for tonight. Observe their patterns, move in before dawn, when most will be sleeping. As the others began unpacking their gear, Elizabeth drifted to the edge of the ridge, staring down at the hideout. So close to the men who had destroyed her home, to Frank who had betrayed his own brother's memory, her fingers itched to uncork the vials in her saddlebags to rain down chemical fire on the camp below. But Mason's presence complicated matters, as did Jake's earnest belief in the law. Even Goldman, for all his loyalty, would balk at wholesale slaughter. Planning something, Mason's voice came from behind her. Elizabeth didn't turn. Just thinking. About justice or revenge. The sheriff moved to stand beside her, his weathered face grave in the fading light. Is there a difference when the crime is severe enough? Mason considered this. Maybe not in the outcome, but in the soul of the one who delivers it? Yes, Mrs. Hawkins, there's a world of difference. Elizabeth finally looked at him. Tell that to the Peterson children. Tell that to every family Blackwood terrorized while you wrote reports and waited for permission to act. Mason winced as if struck. I have my regrets, ma'am, more than you know, but adding more bodies to the pile won't undo what's been done. No, Elizabeth agreed softly, but it will ensure they never do it again. As darkness fell, they established a cold camp, no fire, that might alert the men in the valley to their presence. They ate jerky and hard biscuits in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation to come. Jake took the first watch, positioning himself where he could observe the camp below. The other deputy, Miller, had introduced him as Hank Collins, cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. Speaking little, Goldman dozed fitfully, his aged body protesting the hard ground. Mason sat apart, writing in a small notebook by the light of a carefully shielded lantern. Elizabeth pretended to sleep, but her mind was active, formulating and discarding plans. She needed to separate from the others before they reached the camp, needed freedom to use her chemical weapons without witnesses or interference. But how her thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound from the direction of Colin's bedroll, a soft, strangled gasp followed by a dull thud. Elizabeth's eyes snapped open in time to see a dark figure straightening up from Colin's now still form. She reached for her rifle but froze as the figure turned toward her. A woman silhouetted against the night sky, finger to her lips in a gesture for silence. Don't scream, Mother, the woman whispered, her voice achingly, impossibly familiar. It's me. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Sarah. The name escaped her lips as a strangled whisper. The woman knelt beside her. In the faint moonlight, Elizabeth could make out features she had mourned for 5 long years, but changed, hardened. The round face of 15 had given way to the angular beauty of 20. Where there had once been innocence, there was now a cold calculation that mirrored Elizabeth's own wartime expression. "You're dead," Elizabeth breathed. "We buried you." "You buried someone," Sarah corrected quietly. "But not me." Goldman stirred at the sound of voices. Sarah moved with startling speed, pressing a cloth over his mouth and nose. The old doctor struggled briefly, then went limp. "What have you done?" Elizabeth hissed, finally finding her voice. "Chloroform," Sarah replied calmly. "He'll wake in an hour, as will the deputy." She nodded toward Collins. "We don't have much time. The sheriff will return from his patrol soon." Elizabeth's mind reeled, unable to process the apparition before her. How? How are you alive? We found your body in the creek. Thomas identified you." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Later, Mother, I promise to explain everything. But now we must move. Frank Hawkins knows you're coming. There's a trap waiting in the valley." The mention of Frank snapped Elizabeth back to the present crisis. Dead daughter or ghost or hallucination, it didn't matter. What mattered was the warning. "How do you know about Frank?" "I've been watching the gang for months," Sarah replied, "ever since I regained my memory. When I heard about the attack on our farm, I knew you would come seeking revenge." "Oh, your memory." Sarah touched her temple, where a thin scar disappeared into her hairline. "The men who attacked me, they left me for dead in the creek. But I survived. Though my mind was broken, I wandered nameless until a Salish family found me. They cared for me while I healed, but I didn't remember who I was until last winter when the fever broke." Elizabeth struggled to comprehend this miraculous tale. Her daughter alive all this time. The grave they had dug, the body they had buried, who had it been? And why hadn't Sarah come home once her memory returned? As if reading her thoughts, Sarah said, "I couldn't come back, not yet. Not until I found the men who did this to me, who made me lose 5 years of my life." "Blackwood's gang," Elizabeth whispered. Sarah nodded. "I've been tracking them since spring, working my way into their confidence, learning their secrets, their plans." Her voice grew harder. "Waiting for my chance. For revenge," Elizabeth said, recognizing the same cold fire that burned in her own heart. "Justice," Sarah corrected, unconsciously echoing Jake's earlier words. "The same justice you've come to deliver." A soft noise from the trail alerted them to Mason's return. Sarah melted into the shadows with practiced ease. "Meet me below the eastern ridge in 10 minutes, she whispered. "Come alone." Then she was gone, a ghost in the darkness. Mason found Elizabeth sitting upright, ostensibly on watch, when he returned to camp. If he noticed her shocked expression or trembling hands, he attributed it to the cold mountain air. "All quiet at the camp below," he reported. "They've posted guards, but most seem to be sleeping or drinking." Elizabeth nodded mechanically, her mind still reeling from Sarah's appearance. "You should rest, Sheriff. I'll wake everyone before dawn." "Succoram." Mason glanced at the sleeping forms of Goldman, Collins, and Jake. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Elizabeth managed. "Just quiet." The sheriff looked unconvinced but too tired to press the issue. He rolled himself in his blanket and was soon breathing deeply. Elizabeth waited until she was certain Mason was asleep before gathering her saddlebags. She moved silently past the unconscious forms of Goldman and Collins, pausing briefly beside the old doctor. If Sarah was telling the truth about the chloroform, he would indeed wake soon unharmed. If not, she pushed the thought away. Whatever phantasm or deception awaited her, below the ridge she had to know. The descent was treacherous in the darkness. Twice Elizabeth nearly lost her footing on the loose shale. By the time she reached the designated meeting place, her wounded shoulder throbbed anew, fresh blood staining her bandages. Sarah was waiting seated on a fallen log, her face clearer now in the moonlight that filtered through the sparse trees. She had Thomas's nose, Elizabeth noted with a pang. His stubborn chin. "You came," Sarah said, rising. "I wasn't sure you would." "If you're truly my daughter, you know I would walk through fire to find you," Elizabeth replied, keeping her distance. "And if you're not, if this is some trick of Frank's, then I wanted to look into the eyes of whoever would use my dead child against me." Sarah approached slowly, hands visible to show she carried no weapon. "Ask me something only Sarah would know." Elizabeth swallowed hard. "The day before you disappeared, What did we argue about? A sad smile touched Sarah's lips. My hair, you wanted me to pin it up like a proper young lady. I wanted to wear it loose like the Salish girls I'd befriended. We didn't speak at dinner. Father tried to make peace between us. Elizabeth's composure cracked. It was such a small detail, such a trivial argument. Their last words before tragedy struck. No one else could have known Sarah. She whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch her daughter's face. My Sarah. For a moment they clung to each other, years of separation, dissolving in shared tears. But only for a moment. Sarah pulled back first, her expression hardening into resolve. We have work to do, Mother. She said, Frank has united what's left of Blackwood's gang. They're planning to abandon the hideout at first light, heading for Canada with their plunder. Elizabeth wiped her eyes, forcing herself back to the present crisis. The sheriff plans to move before dawn. Arrest them. Sarah laughed grimly. Arrest, they have a lookout posted high on the ridge. They know exactly where your camp is. The moment you move toward the valley, sharpshooters will cut you down. Then we warn Mason. And then what? Even if you avoid the ambush, there are at least 15 armed men down there. The sheriff's badge won't stop their bullets. Elizabeth studied her daughter's face, seeing her own determination reflected there. What do you suggest? I've been working on their cook, a man named Harlow. He's not like the others. Got caught up in something he regrets, but sees no way out. Sarah reached into her jacket, producing a small vial filled with dark liquid. I told him this would buy his freedom. Elizabeth recognized the formulation immediately. My compound from the war. Sarah nodded. I found your journal in the root cellar last year after I remembered who I was. Studied it. The recipe for mercy in darkness. You called it. It was meant for dying soldiers beyond help, Elizabeth said quietly. A painless end to suffering. And now it will end more suffering before it begins. Sarah's voice was implacable. Harlow will add this to the coffee tonight. By midnight, most of the gang will be dead or dying. The few who don't drink coffee will be disoriented, trying to understand what's happening. That's when we strike. Elizabeth stared at her daughter. This stranger was Sarah's face, but a killer's cold calculation. You've become like me. I learned from your journal. Sarah said simply, about the war, the choices you made, how sometimes the only mercy is a swift end. Elizabeth felt a profound grief, not for the daughter she had lost in the creek, but for the innocent child who would never return. The Sarah before her had been transformed by trauma and revenge, just as Elizabeth had been transformed by the war. There must be another way, she said, though, without conviction. There isn't. Sarah's tone brooked no argument. I've watched these men, Mother, seen what they do to those who cross them, the women they've violated, the children they've orphaned. Her voice caught slightly. What they did to me? Frank, Elizabeth asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah's eyes hardened. He led them to me that day, told them about his pretty niece who needed to be taught some manners, watched while they... She broke off, unable to continue. Elizabeth felt something inside her harden, past the point of breaking. Thomas's own brother had orchestrated their daughter's assault, had believed her dead all these years. Give me the vial, she said, hand outstretched. If this is to be done, I'll do it. Sarah shook her head. It's already arranged. Harlow is waiting for my signal. She gestured toward the valley. But I need your help with the aftermath. There will be survivors, those who don't drink the coffee, or who metabolize the poison differently. What about the sheriff? Elizabeth asked. And Jake, they'll try to stop us. The chloroform will keep them unconscious until it's over, Sarah assured her. By the time they wake, we'll have completed our work. They can arrest whoever remains alive, take credit for bringing down the Blackwood gang. Everyone wins. Elizabeth wasn't convinced. And Goldman, he's an old man. Sarah, the chloroform could harm him. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, a brief softening. I was careful with the dosage. He'll recover fully. She touched Elizabeth's arm. I remember Dr. Goldman. His kindness when I had scarlet fever as a child. I wouldn't harm him. This small glimpse of the old Sarah reassured Elizabeth more than any logical argument could have. Her daughter was changed, hardened, but not lost completely to hatred. "What's your plan?" she asked finally. Sarah smiled grimly. "I thought you'd never ask." As Sarah outlined her strategy, Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of pride, horror, and resignation. The detailed planning, the careful consideration of contingencies, she recognized her own methodical approach, honed in battlefield hospitals where split-second decisions meant life or death. But there was something else in Sarah's plan, something Elizabeth had never possessed even in her darkest moments, a capacity for calculated cruelty. The poison was just the beginning. What Sarah proposed for the survivors. Particularly Frank went beyond justice or even revenge. It approached a ritual of pain that made even Elizabeth's war-hardened soul recoil. "This isn't like you, Sarah," she said when her daughter finished. "The girl I raised had compassion. That girl died in the creek." Sarah replied flatly, "I'm what remains." Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility crushing her chest. She had created this not just in giving birth to Sarah, but in leaving her journals where they could be found. In writing down the darkest knowledge from the war, knowledge that should have died with those desperate days. "We don't have much time," Sarah continued, mistaking Elizabeth's silence for hesitation. "Harlow will add the compound to the coffee at the next watch change. We need to be in position before the effects begin." Elizabeth nodded slowly. Whatever moral qualms she harbored, they paled beside her. Need to protect the daughter miraculously returned to her. To ensure Frank Hawkins never harmed another soul. "Lead the way," she said. They descended further into the valley, moving carefully through the darkness. Sarah navigated the terrain with the confidence of someone who had traveled it many times before. As they drew nearer to the camp, she pointed out hidden lookout positions, potential escape routes, in the building where Frank likely slept. "The main bunkhouse is there," she whispered, indicating a long, low structure on the far side of the compound. "Most of the men sleep there. That's where the coffee is served." Elizabeth studied the layout, military precision replacing emotion, and Frank, the foreman's cabin. Sarah replied, pointing to a smaller building, set apart from the others. "He took it after Blackwood died. Thinks it shows his new authority. Guards. 2 at the main entrance to the valley, another watching the trail. All will be served coffee at the watch change." Elizabeth nodded mentally, calculating timing, dosages, effects. The compound Sarah had described would work quickly once ingested: paralysis, spreading from the extremities followed by respiratory depression, then cardiac arrest. Death would come within minutes, relatively painless, but terrifying for those who remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. "We wait here," Sarah directed, settling behind a large boulder with clear sightlines to the camp. "Once the compound takes effect, we'll hear it. The confusion, perhaps some shouting before their voices fail." Elizabeth positioned herself beside her daughter, rifle ready. A terrible calm had settled over her, the same icy detachment she'd felt in field hospitals when amputations began and emotion became a liability. "If this fails," she said quietly, "if they discover Harlow before—" "It won't fail," Sarah interrupted. "But if it does, I've prepared for that too." She patted a satchel at her side. "More direct methods." Elizabeth glanced at the satchel, recognizing its medicinal shape. "My old field kit. I recovered it from the root cellar," Sarah confirmed. "Along with your journal and father's medal." The mention of Thomas sent a pang through Elizabeth's heart. What would he think of this dark reunion of his wife and daughter poised to commit mass murder in the name of justice? "Your father wanted us to leave the war behind," she said softly, "to build something clean and new." Sarah's expression didn't change. "Father isn't here. The men who took that future from us are—" She checked her pocket watch. "It's time. Harlow will be serving the coffee now." They waited in tense silence. Minutes stretched like hours. Elizabeth found herself counting heartbeats, each one seeming to echo in the stillness of the mountain night. Then faintly at first, sounds began to drift from the camp. A shout, the crash of something falling. More voices, urgent, now calling for help. "It's begun," Sarah whispered, a terrible satisfaction in her voice. The commotion in the camp intensified. Lanterns flared to life as men stumbled from the bunkhouse. Even from their hidden position, Elizabeth could see figures collapsing, some clawing at their throats, others simply crumpling to the ground. "How many would you estimate drank the coffee?" she asked clinically. "At least 10, Sarah replied. "Maybe 12. Elizabeth nodded. If Sarah's count of 15 total men was accurate, that left only a few to deal with those who preferred tea or whiskey to coffee, or who happened to be away from the bunkhouse when the poison brew was served. Among the confusion, a figure emerged from the foreman's cabin. Even at this distance, Elizabeth recognized Frank Hawkins's distinctive silhouette, the slight stoop to his shoulders that had always distinguished him from Thomas's military bearing. Frank wasn't affected. She observed. "Good," Sarah said coldly. "I wanted him aware for what comes next." Frank was shouting orders, trying to impose order on the chaos. But his men continued to fall, some now lying motionless on the ground, others thrashing in their final moments. "Now," Sarah said, rising into a crouch. While they're disoriented, they moved swiftly down the slope, using the confusion as cover. As they neared the edge of the camp, a guard appeared, staggering, but still on his feet. Before Elizabeth could raise her rifle, Sarah had thrown a knife with surgical precision. The blade embedded itself in the man's throat, dropping him without a sound. Elizabeth stared at her daughter, momentarily shocked by the casual efficiency of the killing. But there was no time for questions. They were committed now. They entered the camp from different directions as planned. Elizabeth moved toward the bunkhouse, rifle ready. Inside, the scene was apocalyptic. Bodies lay contorted on bunks and floor faces, frozen in expressions of terror and confusion. The sickly, sweet smell of the compound hung in the air. One man still lived barely. His eyes found Elizabeth as she entered, recognition and fear dawning as paralysis climbed up his body. "You," he gasped. "The widow." Elizabeth knelt beside him, checking his pulse clinically. The compound had reached his diaphragm. Each breath came more labored than the last. "Blackwood burned my home," she said quietly. "Killed my dog. Thought he killed my daughter years ago." The man tried to speak again, but only a gurgle emerged. His eyes, however, remained alert, comprehending. "This is a better death than you deserve," Elizabeth told him. "Cleaner than what you gave the Peterson family." She watched dispassionately as his breathing faltered, then ceased. No merciful adjustments to the dose this time, as she might have offered a suffering soldier. This man had made his choices. Outside gunshots rang out, 3 in rapid succession. Elizabeth hurried to the door. Rifle raised in the center of the camp, Sarah stood over 2 fallen men, revolver still smoking in her hand. Of Frank there was no sign. The foreman's cabin. Sarah called, already moving in that direction. Elizabeth followed, stepping carefully around the bodies of poisoned men. The efficiency of the slaughter disturbed her despite her own complicity. This wasn't the calculated mercy of her wartime work. This was execution, plain and simple. At the foreman's cabin, they positioned themselves on either side of the door. Sarah nodded once, then kicked it open. Elizabeth entered, low rifle sweeping the interior. "Empty. He's running?" Sarah spat fury, replacing her earlier cold calculation. "The coward." They searched the small cabin quickly, finding evidence of hasty departure. A half-packed saddlebag lay on the bed, spilling banknotes and ammunition. "There." Elizabeth pointed to boot prints in the dust leading toward the rear window. "He went out the back." They burst through the rear door in time to see a horse and rider disappearing up a narrow trail that wound into the mountains behind the camp. "The old mine shaft," Sarah said grimly. "He's heading for the emergency exit. There are supplies cached there, and another horse." Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted toward the stables, Elizabeth close behind. They mounted quickly, spurring their horses after the fleeing figure. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, but Sarah rode with reckless determination, seemingly immune to the danger of a misstep that could send horse and rider plummeting into the ravine below. Elizabeth struggled to keep pace. Her wound had reopened fully now, blood soaking her shirt beneath her jacket. Each hoofbeat sent pain lancing through her shoulder. But the sight of her daughter ahead, hunting the man who had orchestrated her assault, drove Elizabeth forward. The trail ended at the mouth of an old mine shaft, black and forbidding in the mountainside. Frank's horse stood tethered outside sides, heaving from the hard ride. "He's inside," Sarah said, dismounting smoothly. "There's only one way through. The shaft emerges on the other side of the mountain about half a mile in." Elizabeth slid from her saddle more awkwardly, nearly falling as her boots hit the ground. Sarah noticed her weakness for the first time, eyes widening at the blood staining Elizabeth's jacket. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Elizabeth lied. An old wound reopened. Sarah hesitated, concern warring with her single-minded focus on Frank. For a moment, the daughter Elizabeth remembered shone through her hardened exterior. "Let me bind it at least," she urged. "After," Elizabeth insisted. "Frank first." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Stay behind me. The shaft narrows in places. There are side tunnels where he could hide." They entered the darkness, Sarah lighting a small lantern she took from her saddlebag. The mine shaft was rough-hewn support beams groaning overhead, as if the very mountain resented this intrusion into its depths. The air grew thick with dust and the lingering smell of old dynamite. "Frank," Sarah called, her voice echoing eerily. "We know you're in here. There's nowhere to run." Only silence answered. They proceeded cautiously, Sarah checking each side tunnel as they passed. Elizabeth's senses, honed by years of battlefield alertness, strained for any sound that might betray Frank's location. 100 yards in the main shaft forked, Sarah hesitated, studying the ground for signs of recent passage. "This way," she decided, pointing to the right fork where scuff marks disturbed the dust. "He's moving fast, scared." "He should be," Elizabeth murmured. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to proceed single file. Sarah led lantern, held high revolver, ready in her other hand. Elizabeth followed, fighting dizziness as blood loss took its toll. A sound ahead, a boot scraping on stone. Sarah froze, extinguishing the lantern with a quick movement. Darkness engulfed them, absolute, disorienting. Elizabeth held her breath, listening intently. For several heartbeats, nothing. Then the unmistakable metallic click of a gun hammer being cocked. "I hear you, ladies." Frank's voice came from somewhere ahead, strained but controlled. "That's far enough." Sarah remained motionless, but Elizabeth could sense her tension, like a drawn bowstring, ready to release. "It's over, Frank." Elizabeth called, her voice steady despite her weakening condition. "The rest of Blackwood's men are dead." A harsh laugh echoed from the darkness. "Not my concern, they served their purpose. Now you two are going to back out of this tunnel, nice and slow. I've got dynamite rigged, one shot from me and we all go to hell together." "You're lying," Sarah responded, her voice chillingly calm. "If you had dynamite, you'd have used it already." "Try me," Frank challenged. "I've got nothing to lose now." For a tense moment, silence hung in the darkness. Then Sarah whispered so softly only Elizabeth could hear, "He's bluffing. Stay here." Before Elizabeth could respond, Sarah was moving, her footsteps preternaturally silent on the rocky floor. Elizabeth held her position, listening for any sound that might betray her daughter's location. But Sarah moved like a ghost, a skill she certainly hadn't learned on their peaceful farm. "Where's your daughter, Lizzie?" Frank called, his voice shifting position slightly. He was moving too, trying to locate them in the darkness. "Did she run? Smart girl." Elizabeth said nothing, conserving her strength. The pain in her shoulder had dulled to a steady throb, but cold sweat beaded her forehead. Blood loss was taking its toll. "Thomas always said you were the smart one," Frank continued, filling the silence with nervous chatter. "Said you knew when to cut your losses. This is one of those times, sister-in-law." A soft sound to Elizabeth's right made her tense, but it was only a pebble dislodged from the tunnel wall. Whether by Sarah or Frank, she couldn't tell. "You know what your problem was, Lizzie." Frank's voice had moved again, closer now. "You never understood the way the world really works. Thomas didn't either. All that talk about healing and forgiveness after the war. What good did it do him, dead at 50 from lungs rotted by Yankee prison camps?" Elizabeth's hands tightened on her rifle. Frank was trying to provoke a response, to locate her by sound. She remained silent, though rage burned inside her at his invocation of Thomas's name. "I was patient." Frank continued. Waited years for Thomas to see reason to join the right side, but he chose you, a Yankee nurse with blood on her hands over his own brother. A sudden sharp crack split the darkness. Not a gunshot, but the sound of wood striking bone. A pained grunt followed by the clatter of a dropped weapon Sarah had found Frank. The sounds of struggle echoed through the tunnel. Grunts the impact of fists, bodies slamming against stone walls. Elizabeth moved toward the commotion, hands outstretched in the darkness, trying to distinguish her daughter from her enemy. A flash of light blinded her momentarily as a match flared to life. In its brief illumination, she saw them, Sarah pinned against the wall, Frank's hands around her throat, her knee driving repeatedly into his midsection. The match died, plunging them back into darkness. Elizabeth lunged forward, rifle extended like a club. She connected with something solid, Frank's back judging by the grunt of pain. She swung again, connecting with his shoulder this time. His grip on Sarah must have loosened, for Elizabeth heard her daughter gasp for air. "Mother, move!" Sarah rasped. Elizabeth staggered backward just as a gunshot thundered in the confined space. The muzzle flash illuminated Frank's contorted face for a split second, hatred twisting his features into something barely human. The bullet missed Elizabeth by inches, embedding itself in the tunnel wall. But the flash gave Sarah the target she needed. She launched herself at Frank, something metallic, glinting in her hand, a surgical scalpel from Elizabeth's old medical kit. Frank screamed as the blade found flesh. The sound echoed, magnified by the tunnel's acoustics, into something inhuman. Another flash as he fired blindly, the bullet going wide. "Light the lantern." Sarah commanded, her voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. Elizabeth fumbled in her pocket for matches, finally striking one against the rough stone wall. The tiny flame illuminated a scene from Nightmare. Sarah straddling Frank, pinning him to the ground, blood spreading from multiple wounds in his chest and abdomen. The scalpel rose and fell with mechanical precision. "Sarah, stop!" Elizabeth gasped, finally lighting the lantern. "He's finished." Sarah paused, the blade hovering above Frank's ruined chest. Blood covered her hands to the wrists, splattered her face in a grotesque constellation. In the lantern light, her expression was utterly devoid of emotion, a surgeon's focus divorced from the humanity of her patient. Frank gurgled, blood bubbling from his lips, his eyes so like Thomas's, yet fundamentally different, fixed on Elizabeth, with a mixture of hatred and pleading. "Please." He managed the word, barely intelligible through the blood. "Mercy," Sarah asked, her voice distant. "Like the mercy you showed me. The 15-year-old girl you offered to Blackwood's men for sport." Frank's eyes widened at the revelation of Sarah's identity. His lips moved, forming what might have been impossible, though no sound emerged. "I survived," Sarah told him, leaning close to his ear. "I remembered, and now, Uncle Frank, you'll feel what I felt. Helpless, afraid, praying for death that won't come quickly enough." "Sarah," Elizabeth said sharply, recognizing the darkness consuming her daughter, the same darkness that had nearly claimed her during the war's worst days. "Enough!" Sarah looked up, and for a moment Elizabeth saw the void behind her eyes, a chasm of trauma and revenge that might never be filled. Then something shifted. Humanity returned, bringing with it pain so acute it made Sarah's breath catch. "He deserves to suffer," she whispered, but the certainty had left her voice. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, kneeling beside them, despite her weakness, "but we don't deserve to carry that suffering forward." She gently took the scalpel from Sarah's unresisting fingers. Then, with the clinical precision that had earned her both gratitude and fear during the war, Elizabeth found the artery in Frank's neck and opened it with a single clean stroke. "A mercy you don't deserve," she told her brother-in-law as his life drained away. "For Thomas's sake, not yours." Frank's eyes remained fixed on hers as awareness faded from them. His body convulsed once, then stilled. For a long moment, mother and daughter remained motionless, the lantern casting their shadows as grotesque giants against the tunnel walls. Then Sarah slumped forward, the inhuman strength that had sustained her, suddenly exhausted. "Mother," she said, her voice that of a lost child. "What have I become?" Elizabeth gathered her daughter into her arms, heedless of the blood that soaked them both. "What the world made you," she answered softly, but not what you must remain. They held each other as the lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows over Frank's body. Outside, dawn would be breaking over the mountains. The sheriff and his deputies would be waking, finding the camp full of dead men, wondering what force of nature or justice had swept through in the night. "We should go," Elizabeth said finally. "There's nothing more for us here." Sarah nodded, rising shakily to her feet. She looked down at Frank's body with an expression Elizabeth couldn't quite interpret. Not satisfaction, not remorse, but something more complex. The look of someone closing a chapter written in blood and pain. "What now?" Sarah asked as they made their way back through the tunnel, supporting each other. "We can't go back to White Ridge." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "Too many questions, too many bodies. I've saved some money." Sarah offered, "Enough to start again somewhere, California maybe." Elizabeth considered this California a new beginning, far from Montana's blood-soaked soil, far from the graves they dug and the memories that haunted them. Yes, she decided, California. They emerged from the mine shaft into the golden light of dawn. The world looked strangely beautiful after the darkness underground. The sky impossibly blue. The pine forests a vibrant green against the mountains' rocky faces. Their horses waited patiently, undisturbed by the night's violence. As they mounted, Elizabeth swayed dangerously, blood loss, finally taking its inevitable toll. Sarah was at her side, instantly supporting her. "You need a doctor," she said urgently. Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "I am a doctor. Get me to Goldman's. He'll help." "And the sheriff, the deputies?" "Leave them a message," Elizabeth suggested, fighting to remain conscious. "Something to help them understand, without revealing too much?" Sarah nodded already, fashioning a makeshift bandage from her shirt to stanch Elizabeth's bleeding. "We'll need to avoid the main trail. There's another way down the mountain, longer but safer." So, as they rode, Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness. Images blurred the shadowy mine tunnel, the blood-soaked ground, Frank's dying eyes so like Thomas's. In older images, field hospitals during the war. Dying boys crying for their mothers. Thomas's face when he'd found her administering her mercy to the wounded. Beyond saving, "I've become what I feared," she murmured feverishly, "a dealer in death." "No." Sarah's voice came as if from a great distance. "A survivor like me." By mid-morning, they had reached the outskirts of White Ridge, approaching Goldman's apothecary from the back alley to avoid being seen. Sarah helped Elizabeth dismount, practically carrying her to the rear door. Goldman himself answered their knock, his aged face lined with worry that deepened to shock at the sight of them. Blood-soaked, exhausted, Sarah's existence itself a walking miracle. "My God," he breathed. "Sarah, how could he?" Later, Sarah cut him off. "Mother's wounded. She's lost too much blood." Goldman ushered them inside, his physician's instincts overriding his questions. He cleared his examination table with a sweep of his arm, helping Sarah lay Elizabeth upon it. "The bullet wound reopened," he observed, cutting away Elizabeth's bloodied bandages. "And new trauma." "What happened up there?" "Justice," Elizabeth whispered before losing consciousness entirely. She woke to the familiar smell of Goldman's medicinal herbs and the soft murmur of voices. Sunlight streamed through a high window, suggesting it was midday, though of which day she couldn't be certain. "She's stirring," Goldman's voice said from nearby. Elizabeth opened her eyes to find herself in Goldman's private quarters above the apothecary. Sarah sat beside her bed, her face cleaned of blood, but still bearing the hollow-eyed look of someone who had walked through hell. How long?" Elizabeth asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Nearly 2 days." Goldman answered, offering her water. "You lost a great deal of blood. I wasn't certain you'd pull through." Elizabeth drank gratefully. "The sheriff returned yesterday," Sarah replied. "With his deputies, they found the camp just as we left it. And Frank, still in the mine tunnel as far as I know. They're searching the mountain trails but haven't found him yet." Elizabeth nodded slightly, the movement sending pain through her bandaged shoulder. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing." Goldman said, "They haven't come here yet, though I expect they will soon. Mason knows I treated your wounds before. He'll have questions about what happened at the camp." Elizabeth murmured. All those men dead by poison. A method no ordinary outlaw would know. Goldman agreed gravely. It points to someone with medical knowledge. Sarah leaned forward. I left them a message as you suggested, a purple wildflower on each body, and a note pinned to the bunkhouse door. What did it say? Elizabeth asked, though she dreaded the answer. Justice comes to those who mock the grieving. Let this be a warning to all who prey on the defenseless. Sarah recited from memory, signed the widow's daughter. Elizabeth closed her eyes. The theatrical flourish was unnecessary, even dangerous. It all but named them as the perpetrators. The territorial marshal arrives today. Goldman added. Masons sent for him given the scale of the slaughter. We need to leave, Elizabeth decided, struggling to sit up, despite Goldman's protests. Tonight, if possible. You're too weak, the old doctor objected. I'll manage. Elizabeth fixed her gaze on Sarah. California, as we discussed, a new beginning. Sarah nodded determination, replacing the fatigue in her eyes. I'll make preparations. There's a westbound stage tomorrow morning. Goldman looked between them, conflict evident on his weathered face. This is madness, Elizabeth. You can barely stand, let alone travel. Would you rather see us hang? Elizabeth asked bluntly. Because that's what awaits if we stay 15 men dead by poison. No judge will show mercy regardless of what Blackwood's gang did to deserve their fate. The old doctor had no answer to this. He knew the truth of her words. Help us, Elias. Elizabeth implored softly. One last time. Goldman's shoulders slumped in resignation. I'll prepare medicines for your journey, something for the pain and to prevent infection. He moved to the door, then paused. What should I tell Mason when he comes asking questions? The truth, Elizabeth replied after a moment's consideration. That I came to you wounded, that you treated me as your oath required, that I left against your advice. Nothing more, Goldman nodded gravely. And the rest, the poison, the method of it all. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. Some knowledge should die with those who possess it. After the doctor left to prepare their supplies, Elizabeth turned to her daughter. In the clear light of day, she could study Sarah properly for the first time, the changes 5 years had wrought. The girl she remembered had been replaced by a woman hardened by trauma and survival. Yet the core of her remained Thomas's determined chin, Elizabeth's own calculating intelligence in the eyes. We need to discuss what happened in that tunnel, Elizabeth said quietly. What I saw you become, Sarah's expression closed like a shutter. I did what was necessary. No, Elizabeth corrected gently. What you did to Frank went beyond necessity. It was cruelty for cruelty's sake. Vengeance consuming you from within. Sarah looked away, jaw tight. You don't know what they did to me. I can imagine, Elizabeth said, reaching for her daughter's hand, despite the pain the movement caused. During the war, I saw atrocities that haunt me still. Young women violated by soldiers, children orphaned, and worse, I carried that rage too. Then you understand why Frank deserved to suffer. I understand the desire, Elizabeth acknowledged. But Sarah, that path leads only to more darkness. I nearly lost myself to it once. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. How did you step back from it? Your father, Elizabeth said simply. Thomas saw what the war was making me, a dispenser of death rather than life. He helped me find another way. Father isn't here, Sarah whispered, echoing her words from the mountain. No, Elizabeth agreed sadly. But I am, and I won't watch you destroy yourself with hatred, not when I've just found you again. Sarah looked down at their clasped hands, her own still bearing traces of blood in the creases of her knuckles, impossible to fully wash away. I don't know how to let it go, she admitted. The anger, it's all that kept me alive some days. We learned together, Elizabeth promised, in California. Away from all of this, a noise from the street below interrupted them. Horses arriving, men's voices, raised in official tones. Through the window, Elizabeth glimpsed Sheriff Mason dismounting alongside a stranger wearing a territorial marshal's badge. They're here, she whispered urgently. Sarah moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. Mason, another deputy, and the marshal, she reported. They're entering the apothecary now. Elizabeth struggled to rise, but agony lanced through her shoulder. We need to go. Now, you can't even stand. Sarah objected. Let me handle this. Before Elizabeth could protest, Sarah had moved to the door, locking it quietly. She returned to the window, throwing it open to reveal a narrow ledge running along the building's side. The stable roof is just below, she explained, gathering their few possessions. We can cross to the next building, then down to the alley. Elizabeth stared at her daughter in amazement. You've planned this. I've planned for every contingency, Sarah confirmed, helping Elizabeth to her feet. I had 5 years to learn survival. Mother, trust me now. Voices drifted up from below. Goldman greeting the lawmen, his tone carefully neutral. They had minutes at most before the deputies would come searching the upper floor. With Sarah's help, Elizabeth climbed painfully onto the window ledge. The drop to the stable roof below looked impossibly far in her weakened state, but there was no alternative. Sarah climbed out behind her, supporting her as they edged along the narrow ledge. Easy, Sarah murmured, one step at a time. They reached the corner of the building just as boots sounded on the stairs inside. Sarah helped Elizabeth make the short drop to the slanted stable roof, then followed with cat-like grace. They crossed quickly to the adjacent building, keeping low to avoid being seen from the street. By the time Mason and the marshal reached Goldman's empty room, Elizabeth and Sarah were descending into the back alley, where 2 horses waited already saddled and provisioned. Goldman? Elizabeth realized he prepared for this too. Sarah nodded, helping her mother mount, despite her weakness. He knows what awaits if they catch us. This gives us both deniability. They rode slowly through the back alleys of Whiteridge, avoiding the main street where the lawmen's horses were tethered. Once clear of the town, they urged their mounts to a faster pace, heading not west toward the stage route, but south toward the border with Wyoming territory. Not California? Elizabeth asked as they rode. Not directly, Sarah explained. We'll cross into Wyoming, then cut west through the southern passes. A longer route, but safer. Less chance of pursuit. Elizabeth nodded, impressed despite her concern. You've thought of everything. I had to, Sarah said simply, for both our sakes. They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only when Elizabeth's strength gave out entirely. Sarah made camp in a sheltered hollow, tending to her mother's wounds with the supplies Goldman had provided. As Elizabeth drifted towards sleep exhaustion and medicine dulling the pain, she murmured, All I ever wanted was a peaceful life for us, for you to grow up without knowing the horrors I'd seen. She agreed. Sarah tucked the blanket around her mother, her expression softening in the firelight. Perhaps we can find the peace still, she said, not the same peace we might have had, but something new. Something new, Elizabeth echoed, closing her eyes. Yes. 3 days later, they crossed the border into Wyoming territory. Elizabeth's strength was returning slowly, though she still rode slumped in the saddle for much of each day. The mountain passes stretched before them, snow-capped even in summer, a formidable barrier between their past and whatever future awaited. They had seen no sign of pursuit, but Sarah remained vigilant, choosing their campsites carefully and setting simple alarms threads strung with tiny bells across game trails leading to their position. Elizabeth recognized military techniques in her daughter's precautions, further evidence of the life she'd led during those lost 5 years. Where did you learn all this? She asked one evening as Sarah checked the perimeter of their camp. The Salish family that found you. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. Not entirely. After I recovered physically, but still had no memory, I was found by another group men who recognized my potential. What men? Elizabeth pressed, suddenly uneasy. Bounty hunters. Sarah admitted reluctantly, looking for deserters from both armies even years after the war. Men with prices on their heads. She met her mother's shocked gaze steadily. I was good at tracking, at remaining unseen. They taught me the rest. You hunted men, Elizabeth said softly. For money. I didn't know who I was, Sarah reminded her defensively. I had no past, no identity beyond the skills I possessed. They gave me purpose, called me Shadow, for how I moved. Elizabeth absorbed this revelation in silence. Her daughter, her gentle Sarah, who had once nursed injured birds back to health, transformed into a predator by trauma and circumstance. The parallels to her own wartime transformation were not lost on her. "When did your memory return?" she asked finally. "Last winter." Sarah stared into the campfire, seeing past events Elizabeth could only imagine. "Fever, I was tracking a man through the bitterroots in a snowstorm, got caught in it, nearly died. An old trapper found me, nursed me through the fever." She paused, swallowing hard. "I called out for you in my delirium, for father names started coming back, then faces, then everything else. And you came looking for us." Sarah nodded. "I found the farm first, watched from a distance, saw father's grave marker, and mine." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Strange seeing your own grave." "We buried a girl from the Salish tribe," Elizabeth explained quietly. "Never identified. Thomas and we were so certain it was you. The clothes of the location where she was found. Blackwood's men took my dress." Sarah said, her voice flat. "Put it on her after they were done with her, to throw off any search." Elizabeth closed her eyes against a wave of grief and rage. "If we had known, if we had searched harder." "You couldn't have known," Sarah said, reaching across to touch her mother's hand. "And I wouldn't have remembered you anyway. Not then." They sat in silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in thoughts of what might have been. Finally, Elizabeth asked the question that had been troubling her since the mine tunnel. "After your memory returned, when you found the farm, why didn't you come to us, to me, after father died?" Sarah's expression clouded. "I wanted to, but by then I'd tracked down one of the men who had attacked me. Learned about Blackwood's gang, their connection to Frank." Her hands curled into fists. "I needed to finish it, to make them pay. I couldn't bring that darkness to your door. Instead, it came on its own." Elizabeth observed, "When Blackwood's men attacked the farm." "I was already watching them by then," Sarah admitted, "planning my approach. When I saw them ride to our land, I wanted to intervene, but I was too far away. By the time I reached the farm, you had already driven them off." "At a cost," Elizabeth said, remembering Scout's final yelp. Sarah's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I'm sorry about Scout. He was a good dog." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed softly, "the best." Another silence fell between them, more comfortable than the last. Elizabeth studied her daughter across the campfire, trying to reconcile the young woman before her. With the child she remembered, the Sarah of her memory laughed easily, collected wildflowers, sang as she helped with chores. This Sarah moved like a predator, watched the darkness with cold calculation, carried weapons with practiced familiarity. Yet there were glimpses of the old Sarah, still in the gentle way she tended Elizabeth's wounds, in her occasional smiles, when remembering happier times in the care she took, setting up camp each night to ensure her mother's comfort. "We should reach the southern pass in 2 days," Sarah said, changing the subject. "From there, it's a week's ride to the Union Pacific line. We can take the train the rest of the way to California." Elizabeth nodded. "And then San Francisco, maybe, or north to the Redwood Country?" Sarah poked at the fire with a stick. "Somewhere no one knows us, where we can start again." "As mother and daughter?" Elizabeth asked. "Or as strangers?" Sarah looked up sharply. "What do you mean? You've lived a life I know nothing about." Elizabeth explained, "Become someone I barely recognize. I wonder, do you still want the burden of being Sarah Hawkins? Or would you prefer the freedom of whoever you became during those 5 years?" Sarah considered this, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I'm not sure I know how to be Sarah Hawkins anymore," she admitted finally. "That girl died in many ways, but I don't want to be Shadow either. That was someone else's creation, not my choice." "Then who do you want to be?" Elizabeth asked gently. Sarah was silent for a long moment. "Someone new," she said at last. "Someone who carries Sarah's heart, but has learned Shadow's strength. Someone who can sleep without nightmares someday." Elizabeth reached across the fire to take her daughter's hand. "We'll find her together." The following morning dawned clear and cold, the mountain air crisp with the promise of autumn. They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal trace of their presence. As they mounted their horses, Elizabeth noticed Sarah suddenly tense, head cocked as if listening. "What is it?" she asked in a hushed voice. Sarah held up a hand for silence, her expression concentrated. Then Elizabeth heard it too, the distant sound of horses moving at a gallop coming from the direction they had traveled. "Riders," Sarah said grimly, "at least 4 moving fast." "The marshal," Elizabeth suggested. "Mason? Possibly, or bounty hunters." Word spreads quickly about 15 dead outlaws. Sarah's eyes scanned the terrain, calculating. "We need to move. The pass is too exposed." They rode hard through the morning, pushing their horses as fast as the rough terrain allowed. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, then faded as they navigated a series of switchbacks up the mountainside. By midday, they had reached a high plateau overlooking the route behind them. Sarah produced a small spyglass from her saddlebag, scanning the trail below. 5 riders, she reported, the marshal in front, Mason. 2 deputies I don't recognize, and she paused, adjusting the spyglass for a better view. "Who?" Elizabeth pressed. "Jake Miller," Sarah said, collapsing the spyglass with a sharp movement. "Your young deputy friend." Elizabeth felt a pang of betrayal, quickly replaced by understanding. "He's doing his job." Sarah, "Following the law." "A curifam, the law that failed us," Sarah retorted bitterly. "That would hang us for delivering justice where it could not, or would not," Elizabeth amended. "There's a difference." They continued across the plateau, the wind growing stronger as they approached its far edge. Below the southern pass was visible a narrow defile between towering peaks, the route pioneered by fur trappers decades earlier. "We can lose them in the pass," Sarah decided. "There are caves I know from before, places to hide until they give up the search." Elizabeth studied her daughter's face, the determined set of her jaw, the calculating coldness in her eyes. She recognized the expression, had seen it in her own reflection during the war's darkest days, when necessity had driven her to actions that still haunted her dreams. "No," she said firmly. Sarah turned to her in surprise. "No, no more running, no more hiding, no more death." Elizabeth straightened in her saddle despite the pain it caused her. "I won't spend whatever years remain to me looking over my shoulder, teaching you to live in fear. It's not fear, Mother, it's survival. It's existing, not living," Elizabeth corrected. "And it will hollow you out until there's nothing left but shadow." Sarah's expression hardened. "What's your alternative? Surrender? Let them hang us both. Face them," Elizabeth said simply. "Tell the truth, our truth. Let justice take its proper course." "You can't be serious," Sarah laughed incredulously. "They won't care why we did it. 15 men are dead. The law only sees that. The law sees what men like Mason interpret." Elizabeth countered. "He knew Thomas respected him. He's followed us for days without firing a shot when he could have ambushed us at any time." Sarah shook her head adamantly. "It's too great a risk." "Life is risk," Elizabeth said gently. "The alternative is what you've been doing for 5 years, existing in shadows defined by vengeance. I won't lose you to that darkness again. Not now that I've found you." Their gazes locked in silent battle of wills. Elizabeth saw the struggle in her daughter's eyes, the pull of hard-won survival instincts against the yearning for something more than endless flight. "Trust me," Elizabeth urged. "One last time." Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah nodded. "What do you propose? We make camp here," Elizabeth decided. "In the open, let them come to us, and then we talk." Sarah looked deeply skeptical but began unpacking their gear. They built a small fire conspicuous on the open plateau. Elizabeth removed her medical supplies from the saddlebags, laying them out with deliberate care. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, preparing to tell our story. Elizabeth replied, selecting certain vials and powders. "The whole story," an understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "Your journal, the formulas." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Knowledge that should die with those who possess it. As I told Goldman, I won't have it used again by anyone." They waited as the afternoon waned, the fire sending a thin column of smoke into the clear mountain air. A signal impossible to miss for those tracking them. Sarah remained tense, checking her weapons repeatedly, positioning herself where she could see the approach from all directions. "They're coming," she announced, finally nodding toward the trail they had ascended, all five moving cautiously. Elizabeth steeled herself, fighting exhaustion and pain. "Remember," she told her daughter, "no more death, no matter what happens." Sarah's expression remained doubtful, but she nodded once sharp and decisive. The riders appeared at the edge of the plateau, fanning out as they approached a standard military formation designed to limit vulnerability to ambush. Marshal Davis took the center position with Mason and Jake to his right, the other deputies to his left. All had rifles ready, though not yet aimed. They halted 30 yards from the campfire. Marshal Davis, a grim-faced man with an impressive mustache and the leathery skin of someone who'd spent decades in the western sun, studied them through narrowed eyes. "Elizabeth Hawkins." He called Sarah Hawkins. "You are wanted for questioning regarding the deaths of 15 men at Redemption Mine." Elizabeth rose slowly, hands visible. "We've been expecting you, Marshal." Davis's eyebrows rose slightly at her calm demeanor. "You'll come peacefully." "We'll talk," Elizabeth countered, man to man as it were. The marshal exchanged glances with Mason, then dismounted, handing his reins to one of the deputies. Mason and Jake followed suit, approaching on foot, while the other deputies remained mounted rifles, trained on the two women. Sarah stood beside her mother body, tense as a drawn bowstring. Elizabeth could almost feel the calculations running through her daughter's mind. Distances, angles, the time it would take to draw her revolver versus the deputies' reaction speeds. "Peace," Elizabeth murmured, barely audible. "Trust me." The lawman stopped a respectful distance from the fire. Mason's weathered face was unreadable, but Jake couldn't disguise his conflicted emotions. Relief at finding them alive, warring with the duty that had brought him in pursuit. "Mrs. Hawkins." Mason began formally. "We need to discuss what happened at Redemption Mine. And before that," Elizabeth added, "at my farm, and 5 years ago when my daughter supposedly died." Davis frowned. "We're here about 15 dead men, ma'am, not ancient history." "They're connected, Marshal," Elizabeth replied evenly. "More deeply than you can imagine." She gestured to the logs arranged as seating around the fire. "Please sit. This will take some time." To Sarah's evident surprise, the men complied. Though they kept their weapons close at hand, Elizabeth settled across from them, wincing slightly as her wounded shoulder protested the movement. "You're injured," Jake observed with concern. "An old wound," Elizabeth replied, "reopened during recent events." Marshal Davis leaned forward impatiently. "Mrs. Hawkins, I'll be direct. Every man in Blackwood's gang died of poisoning. A type of poisoning no ordinary person would know how to administer. As the widow of a homesteader, where would you acquire such knowledge?" Elizabeth smiled thinly. "Not as the widow of a homesteader, Marshal, as a nurse during the war. Between the state's field hospital, outside Nashville, later near Richmond." Marshal Mason's expression shifted slightly. "Recognition, perhaps respect." "You served 3 years." Elizabeth confirmed. "Saw things no human should see. Learned things, perhaps, no human should know." She met Davis's skeptical gaze directly, including how to end suffering when conventional medicine failed. Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. "Mercy killings." Elizabeth nodded once sharply. "When morphine ran out, when men lay dying in agony with no hope of recovery?" "Yes." "That's still murder," Davis pointed out, though his tone had softened slightly. "Perhaps," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but it was war. Morality blurs in such times." "This isn't wartime," Davis countered. "Those men at Redemption Mine declared war on my family 5 years ago." Elizabeth interrupted, her voice suddenly hard. "When they assaulted my 15-year-old daughter and left her for dead in Stone Creek." A shocked silence followed this pronouncement. Jake looked at Sarah with new understanding, horror dawning in his young face. "We never found who did it," Mason said slowly. "The Salish girl we thought was Sarah. A deliberate deception by Blackwood's men." Elizabeth explained, "My daughter survived, though without her memory." All eyes turned to Sarah, who met their gazes with unflinching stoicism. I remembered everything last winter, she said, speaking for the first time since the lawmen had arrived. Every face, every name, including Frank Hawkins, my father's brother, who led them to me. Mason swore softly. Thomas's brother. Are you certain? Sarah's laugh held no humor. A girl doesn't forget the face of her uncle while he holds her down for other men's amusement. Even Davis, hardened by years enforcing frontier justice, looked disturbed by this revelation. And Frank Hawkins, he wasn't among the dead at the camp. No, Elizabeth said. He was in the mine tunnel. He's still there, I imagine, unless scavengers have found him. Davis studied them both, his expression calculating. You admit to killing all these men. I admit to administering justice where the law failed. Elizabeth corrected, the same law that dismissed 2 previous cases against Blackwood because a territorial judge was in his pocket. Mason couldn't meet her eyes at this, confirming the accusation with his silence. Vigilante justice is still murder. Davis insisted, though, with less conviction than before. Then arrest us, Sarah challenged, suddenly fierce. Take us back to stand trial. Let me tell a jury what Blackwood's men did to me while Frank Hawkins watched. Let my mother explain why she had to defend our home alone when the sheriff refused to help. Mason winced at this. I did what I could within the law. Mrs. Hawkins, the law, Elizabeth repeated softly. The same law that protects the powerful and fails the vulnerable. That allows men like Blackwood to terrorize with impunity while good people suffer. A heavy silence fell around the campfire. Even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for justice to define itself in this remote place beyond civilization's comfortable boundaries. Davis broke the silence first. I have a duty to uphold the law, ma'am, whatever sympathies I might personally hold. Of course, Elizabeth agreed calmly. And I have a duty to my daughter to ensure she has a future beyond revenge and running. She reached into her medical bag, retrieving a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, the binding worn from years of handling. This contains everything, she explained, holding it up. The formulas, the methods, the knowledge that allowed me to deliver both mercy and justice. She extended it toward Davis. Take it, study it if you must, then destroy it. Davis hesitated, clearly suspicious. Why would you surrender such evidence? Because I'm done with death, Elizabeth said simply. Done with the darkness the war taught me to embrace. I want my daughter to have a life of peace, not a legacy of revenge. Sarah stirred beside her, surprise evident in her posture. Mother, it's time, Sarah. Elizabeth cut her off gently. Time to lay down our weapons, all of them. She turned back to Davis, still holding out the journal. My proposal, Marshal. Take this knowledge, ensure it dies with the men who used it for evil. In exchange, grant my daughter the chance to build a new life away from these mountains and their memories. And you? Mason asked quietly. Elizabeth smiled sadly. I've lived my life, Sheriff, made my choices for better or worse. If justice demands a price, I alone should pay it. No. Sarah's composure shattered. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. I was equally responsible. More so, I orchestrated everything after Blackwood's attack on the farm. Hush, Elizabeth commanded, though, without heat. This is my decision, and a noble one, Jake interjected unexpectedly, but unnecessary, perhaps. All eyes turned to the young deputy. He shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny, but continued with growing confidence. Marshal, Sheriff, what purpose would be served by arresting either of them? The territory is safer with Blackwood's gang eliminated. The governor himself authorized extraordinary measures after his nephew's murder. Davis frowned. That doesn't give anyone license to poison 15 men, Deputy Mon. No, Jake agreed readily. But consider the circumstances. Consider justice in its truest sense, not merely the letter of the law. Mason was studying Elizabeth with an unreadable expression. Thomas used to speak of you. He said unexpectedly, said you carried burdens from the war that would have broken lesser souls, said you came west seeking redemption, not just a new start. Elizabeth felt tears threatening for the first time since this ordeal began. He understood me better than I understood myself. She admitted, better than I deserved. What would he want now? Mason pressed, for his wife, his miraculously returned daughter. Peace, Elizabeth whispered. Always peace. Mason nodded as if this confirmed some private hypothesis. He turned to Davis. Marshal, I've been sheriff in this territory for 12 years, seen all manner of evil men do to one another, seen the law's limitations when good people have no recourse against predators. Make your point. Sheriff Davis said, though his tone suggested he already understood. The Blackwood Gang terrorized this territory for years, protected by corrupt officials. They assaulted an innocent girl, murdered families, robbed stages, all with virtual immunity. Mason gestured toward Elizabeth and Sarah. These women did what the law could not or would not. Is justice really served by punishing them? Now, Davis removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. The law isn't about revenge, Sheriff. It's about order. Without it, we're no better than the savages these women eliminated. True justice transcends mere law, Elizabeth countered quietly. Something I learned in field hospitals where dying boys begged for mothers they'd never see again, where I had to choose between protocol and mercy. She placed the journal on the ground between them. I don't seek absolution, Marshal, only the chance for my daughter to live free of the shadows that have claimed too many years of her life. Davis studied the journal, then the two women before him. His weathered face revealed the internal struggle between duty and the frontier sense of justice that sometimes superseded written law, in territories where civilization remained a tenuous concept. What happened at Redemption Mine was a tragedy, he said, finally choosing his words with careful precision. 15 desperate men driven to violence by the hard circumstances of frontier life died when their elicits still exploded during a drinking celebration. The resulting fire consumed evidence of their crimes and their lives. Elizabeth blinked in surprise. Beside her, Sarah stiffened. Frank Hawkins. Davis continued, warming to his improvised narrative. Apparently died in a separate incident while fleeing into the mountains, perhaps a falling accident in the old mine tunnels. Tragic but not unprecedented in such hazardous terrain. Mason's face remained impassive, though the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. A comprehensive report, Marshal. Shall I endorse it officially? I believe that would be appropriate. Sheriff Davis agreed gravely. With statements from your deputies confirming these unfortunate incidents. Jake nodded eagerly. Very unfortunate incidents, sir. Exactly as you've described. Davis reached down, picking up Elizabeth's journal with deliberate care. And this medical text recovered from the homestead of the late Thomas Hawkins details treatments developed during the war. Of historical interest only, as its more controversial elements will be redacted before the territorial surgeon reviews it for possible inclusion in the medical college's library. He tucked the journal into his coat, then fixed Elizabeth with a stern gaze. Mrs. Hawkins, I understand you've expressed interest in relocating to California following the tragic loss of your home. I see no reason why a widow and her previously missing daughter should not pursue new opportunities in a more established region. Elizabeth understood what was being offered, not absolution perhaps, but a chance, a beginning, rather than an ending. She glanced at Sarah, who appeared equally stunned by this unexpected turn. That is indeed my intention. Marshal, she confirmed carefully, though I had anticipated delays in my departure. Unnecessary, Davis declared. The sooner new settlers occupy your land claim, the better for territorial development. I suggest you proceed with your plans without delay. Mason rose, signaling the end of this strange, unofficial hearing. The marshal and I still need to examine the mine tunnel. He announced. Deputy Miller, you and Collins escort Mrs. Hawkins and her daughter to the Southern Railroad junction. Ensure they board the westbound train without incident. Jake couldn't quite suppress his relieved smile. Yes, sir. As the lawman prepared to depart, Elizabeth found herself momentarily alone with Marshal Davis, while the others gathered equipment and horses. Why? She asked simply. Davis studied her with shrewd eyes that had seen decades of frontier justice in all its imperfect forms. My sister was a nurse during the war, he said quietly. Richmond, perhaps you knew her. Martha Davis. Elizabeth's breath caught. Tall woman, auburn hair, terrible handwriting but the steadiest hands during amputations. Davis smiled slightly. That's Martha. We worked together for months. Elizabeth confirmed. She saved countless lives with those steady hands. She never spoke of what happened in those field hospitals. Davis continued, but she came home changed, haunted. I recognize that same look in your eyes. He touched the journal in his coat. She kept a similar record, I believe. Never showed it to anyone, but I found it after typhoid took her 3 years ago. Elizabeth understood then, not mercy based on her circumstances alone, but recognition from someone who had glimpsed the war's darkest aspects through another's experience. Thank you, she said simply. Davis nodded once curtly. California's a good place for new beginnings. I hear far enough from old ghosts. And new laws, Elizabeth added with carefully neutral emphasis. Indeed, Shapitoniwan. Davis replaced his hat. Safe journey, Mrs. Hawkins, to you and your daughter both. 2 days later, Elizabeth and Sarah stood on the platform of the Union Pacific Junction Station, a small outpost of civilization in the vast Wyoming wilderness. Jake Miller and Deputy Collins had accompanied them as ordered, maintaining the pretense of escort rather than guard. I still can't believe it, Sarah murmured as they watched the steam engine approach in the distance. After everything, they just let us go. Elizabeth smiled faintly. Not just Sarah. They chose justice over law. It happens more often out here than you might think. Jake approached, looking uncomfortable in his formal role, now that their shared ordeal had created a bond transcending their official relationship. Train will be here in 10 minutes. He announced, I've purchased your tickets to Sacramento, as the sheriff instructed. Thank you, Deputy Miller, Elizabeth said, formally conscious of Collins watching from nearby. Then more quietly, and thank you for everything else. Your support made a difference. Jake nodded, his young face earnest. I wrote to my mother, he said softly, told her I'd found you, that you were the same woman she remembered, someone who did what needed doing, regardless of the cost. Elizabeth felt a bittersweet pang remembering Catherine Reynolds and her newborn son in that desperate field hospital. How strange that the infant she delivered should become the man who helped deliver her from justice's harsher demands. Tell her I remember her courage, Elizabeth replied, and that I see it in her son. As the train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and screech of brakes, Jake stepped closer, pressing something into Elizabeth's hand. Sheriff Mason asked me to give you this, he murmured, said it belongs with family. Elizabeth opened her palm to find Thomas's Union Army medal, the one she'd believed lost in the farm fire that she'd later discovered Sarah had retrieved from the root cellar. How did he found it at Redemption Mine? Jake explained quickly. In Frank's possessions, must have taken it from your farm during the attack. The train conductor called for boarding. Jake stepped back, touching his hat in farewell. Good luck in California, Mrs. Hawkins, Miss Hawkins. Elizabeth tucked the medal safely into her pocket, oddly comforted by its return, as if Thomas himself were accompanying them on this journey toward new beginnings. The passenger car was nearly empty, just an elderly couple and a traveling salesman dozing against the window. Elizabeth and Sarah took seats near the rear, where they could see anyone approaching. Old habits, Elizabeth noted, would take time to fade. As the train lurched into motion, Sarah stared out the window at the receding station. Jake and Collins stood watching their departure, gradually diminishing with distance, until they were merely specks against the vast Wyoming landscape. Will you miss it? Elizabeth asked. The mountains. The life you built there, after. Everything. Sarah considered this, her profile silhouetted against the golden afternoon light streaming through the window. Parts of it, she admitted. The freedom, the clarity of purpose. She turned to her mother, but not the emptiness, not the constant looking over my shoulder, expecting the past to find me. Elizabeth nodded, understanding. California will be different. No more running, no more fighting. I'm not sure I remember how to live without those things. Sarah confessed a vulnerability in her voice that reminded Elizabeth painfully of the 15-year-old she'd lost. We'll learn together, Elizabeth promised, taking her daughter's hand. Day by day. The train gathered speed, carrying them west toward the setting sun. Elizabeth felt exhaustion washing over her, the accumulated fatigue of wounds, grief, vengeance, and unexpected reprieve. As her eyes drifted closed, she thought she glimpsed Thomas sitting across from them, smiling that gentle smile that had first drawn her to him amid the war's chaos. "Rest, Lizzie," he seemed to whisper. "The worst is behind you now." Whether dream or memory, the vision brought comfort. Elizabeth surrendered to sleep, her hands still clasped in her daughter's as the train carried them toward whatever future awaited beyond the mountain's shadow. 1 year later, a letter arrived at Sheriff Mason's office in White Ridge. The envelope bore a San Francisco postmark and contained a brief note along with a pressed purple wildflower, the same type Elizabeth had grown on her Montana farm. The note read simply, "Some wounds only time can heal, but sometimes time needs a little help. We've found our peace at last. I hope you have found yours." It was signed with a single initial, E. However, Mason studied the flower, then carefully placed it between the pages of his Bible. A quiet memorial to justice served beyond the strict confines of law. Outside his window, White Ridge continued its transformation from frontier outpost to proper town. The Blackwood gang had passed into local legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed voices about the widow's revenge. The truth, Mason knew, was both simpler and more complex than the stories: a mother's love, a daughter's resilience, the fine line between justice and vengeance that every frontier lawman walked daily. He closed his Bible, returning it to its drawer. Whatever peace Elizabeth and Sarah Hawkins had found in California, he hoped it would last. Some debts once paid should remain settled forever. She didn't ride back for praise. No one was there to witness the ash and blood she left behind. The orchard still smoldered where the old barn once stood, and the trail behind her was lined with ghosts, not just of the men she faced, but of the life that might have been had they never come knocking. She had loved once, laughed, tended roots, not burned them, but the world changed, and so did she. What they took from her, she didn't recover. She replaced bit by bit, steel for softness, fire for fear. The land will heal slower than she will. Some things won't grow back. But in the hush of twilight, when the wind carries silence instead of screams, she still walks the rows where apples once ripened alone. Yes, but standing, because some stories don't end with a final gunshot. They just quiet down, waiting for the dust to settle. And maybe that's the real question.